Hello, I'm Carl Seibert, and thanks for joining me. Do you remember last year we did a blog post and a video on online metadata viewers, websites that you could go to and check the metadata on a given picture? Kind of handy every now and again if you need that sort of thing. What we have before us today is a new online metadata viewer that's got some cool features that the others don't have, and one really important difference. This one was written by IPTC Managing Director Michael Steidl. And he's not just doing a viewer on a test site, he has actually released the code that drives this thing as an open source project. And here it is on GitHub. If you're a developer, you can download the code and you can integrate this viewer into your own website or your own web apps or even some other application altogether. It has a REST API that you can use. And again, it's licensed under an open source license that's very permissive, and it is basically here for you to make use any way you want from the goodness of Steidl's heart. He also does have a test site up and running where we can, as photographers or website operators, use this thing to look at metadata on pictures. So let's just take a look and see what makes it tick and see what makes it cooler than some of the others that are on the market. Like most of these, you can enter a picture either with the picture's URL from the web, or you can upload it from your computer. So let's pop over here to an old blog post, and we will copy the URL of this particular picture and plug it in and see what happens. So there's the URL. Now we have some choices that we can make here. There we go. About how this information is going to be presented. And we have three choices. We can group the information together by the technical format standards, which is Michael's way of saying by the data blocks, IIM, XMP, or even EXIF. And we remember there are three fields in the EXIF that correspond to IPTC fields. Or we can group them according to content areas, whether it's about people, whether it's about the location, whether it's about the license, that sort of thing. And we have a third choice: compare field values embedded in different formats. Now what that allows us to do is check to see if the metadata in a given file is in sync or not. And we'll circle back to that in a minute, because that is a unique or almost unique function that you pretty much can only otherwise do by looking at the output from the command line tool, EXIF tool. And it's presented here in a very nice, very interesting sort of manner. We can also choose how the field names in the output of this picture are going to be presented. The standard IPTC ones, the technical field names, which are the addresses, more or less, of the fields, or the field ID used by EXIF tool. So that's a really sort of an interesting thing. Let's hit the button and see what happens. So here's this picture as presented. Now here's the compare metadata field tool. And as you can see, it takes a field like the description caption field, shows you what's in the IIM, shows you what's in the XMP, and shows you what's in the EXIF data block, which is nothing in this particular case. I captioned this picture in PhotoMechanic, and PhotoMechanic doesn't write to the EXIF. We can also switch on the display page, and here we have our metadata fields presented by data block. Here are all the fields that have values in them in the IIM, all the fields that have values in them in the XMP, And since this picture came from a scanner, not my camera, and was done in PhotoMechanic, which doesn't write to the EXIF, all the fields that have values in them in the EXIF, which are none whatsoever. So that's pretty cool. If we go back to the request form here, we see a little note that says if you leave the URL blank, it's going to pull up the metadata on the IPTC reference image instead. So let's set our field ID to the EXIF tool IDs for the sake of argument and press the button and see how that looks. Now here we have an infographic showing us each and every field in all the data blocks, and it has named the field according to the way you'd name the field in EXIF tool if you were looking at your metadata that way. That's some really handy information, and if you remember, we also have the choice of naming the fields by their common IPTC names or by their technical, shall we say, address names, presented in this infographic style. And I'll tell you, I just made screenshots of these things to use as infographics for my own personal use, because this is some tremendous information, and it's here just kind of as a freebie. So if we go back to the request form again, option B is do exactly the same thing with files from your computer. And if you're the administrator of this application, you actually have the option to configure it only to take the first part of the image, the header of the image, so that you don't have to upload the whole image, which is actually pretty cool. I believe this test site actually is taking the whole image up, so we're not doing that. If we go back to this old post again, and we will copy the URL of the whole blog post, and then do this third option, check a page for image URLs. From there, we get a list of links to each picture that's on the page, and we can click on them in order, and we can see if they have metadata and what's going on with them. And that's a pretty cool thing too. Now let's talk about this in sync thing. Is it a real thing? Is it just a boy band? What's going on? It's a real thing. It's probably not something that you're going to be worried about every day, but now and again, you might want to visit Stidle's test site and check things out just to make sure you're understanding what's going on in your workflow. Let's imagine for a moment that we are our favorite imaginary photographer, Susie Photographer, and she's working on this picture in Photoshop. This is actually a generic unsplash picture, but we're pretending. And so it's a one-off sort of a deal. She's working on the thing in Photoshop, and she went ahead and she's using Photoshop's file info dialog to add metadata to her picture. And here's a caption. She put in a keyword. She did location information and that sort of thing. Copyright notice. Now, most of this stuff came from her own template, of course. And down at the bottom, because she's getting ready to deliver this picture to our favorite imaginary client, WidgetCo, she did a rights usage terms statement saying that she'd granted a one-time license to use this picture to WidgetCo. Okay, fine. So she saves her picture. Now, let us pretend that we are Susie Photographer's imaginary brother and business partner, Joe Photographer. And Joe Photographer comes back to this picture, and he's getting it ready to deliver to another client because he just sold another license. So Joe rewrites Susie's caption, and instead of the rights usage terms field, which he can't see in the Edit IPTC dialog in XNView, and indeed XNView can't write to it. So instead of using that field, he wrote something in the special instructions field to indicate that he had done a license to this photo for somebody else. And he also happened to notice that the copyright originally was to the company, because that's what's on Susie's template. But for some reason, he thought the correct copyright really, in this particular case, was Susie's individual personal copyright. So he goes ahead and he writes that data. Well, what do we have on our picture now? Well, let's pop over to our metadata viewer and take a quick look and see what we have on this picture. So here we are, and this is that same photo, and I just uploaded it a little earlier. And we can see our fields compared, grouped by the field. In this particular case, the creator field, we can see that the IIM, XMP, and EXIF values all match. So that's nice. Let's look in the caption, and right away, the viewer tells us the EXIF doesn't match the IIM and the XMP. So we're out of sync here. Here we can see Susie's original caption, the Adobe products write to all three data blocks simultaneously. And here we have in the EXIF, remember, XNView doesn't write to the EXIF, neither does PhotoMechanic for that matter. And so here we have Susie's original caption still sitting here in the EXIF data block, and it does not match the edited version that Joe wrote that is written into the IIM and the XMP nice and correctly by XNView. So we know that there's a problem here. And we're going to see a problem with the rights usage terms field as well, because XNView can't write that field, so it can't overwrite that field. That's why Joe didn't use it. Joe used the special instructions field instead. But what he wrote in rights usage terms is still going to be there. So let's assume that we were a user, maybe at the client of these pictures, and we look at it in different software. Here we are in PhotoMechanic. Okay, fine. This is the correct and up-to-date caption that Joe wrote that was written as we saw in the viewer, in the IIM and the XMP. Here's the up-to-date and correct version of the copyright that we saw in the viewer. And here's our rights usage terms field. XNView can't write over it. Joe didn't use it. XNView didn't blank it out or do anything else with it. And it's still here, and it's talking about the license that was issued to WidgetCo. And in the special instructions, it's talking to the license. It's talking about the license to metadata matters that Joe wrote about. So there's the danger. And the business of not writing to the EXIF is an interesting case, because I understand why developers wouldn't want to do that. Philosophically, I don't want to do that either. The EXIF data block is basically for logging information. And it's not read-only. We can write to those fields to our heart's content, but we probably really shouldn't. But there are those three fields that represent IPTC fields that are in that data block. And I personally think that applications that edit and write IPTC metadata should write to all three fields, overwriting what's already there and ensuring that the file is in sync. And indeed, I've suggested to both of those developers that they do that. That said, developers are going to do whatever they feel they need to do for their particular applications. And users are going to use whatever applications they happen to have at hand, and they're probably not even going to think about the implications of it. The implication of that EXIF business is largely for users of Microsoft Windows and the properties dialog in the operating system, and also the Photos application in Windows. which does a number of crazy things and should never be depended upon to read any sort of metadata at all, but you can never depend on your clients or end users not to use those things. And they tend to expose the EXIF version of metadata, never mind that it's not in sync with the other two data blocks, and never mind that it's probably the least likely one to be authoritative. It is probably not going to be the data block that contains the correct information. And that's a good question too. If you're presented with a situation like this, which one of these things do you believe? Well, considering that every competent metadata authoring application that I know of, or maybe we could just say that's by definition, writes to the IIM data block, I would tend to assume that what I see in that data block is probably the most recent and therefore correct edit. And if I'm looking at a case like this where my IIM and my XMP agree and the EXIF is the thing that's out of whack, I would probably put my bet on the IIM. But hey, we're looking at a photo where the photographer took the effort to fill out the metadata, which means that we're going to have contact information for them in here somewhere. And we can get in touch with them. And that's what I would suggest doing, is if you see a situation like this and it's about a photo that you might use, call them up, clarify the situation before you move forward. And if you see a problem like this in your own workflow, just adjust your workflow to compensate for it. If your metadata authoring application doesn't write to the EXIF, that's no problem. Just make sure that there's nothing that's going to hurt you sitting around in the EXIF that you're not looking at or thinking about, and you're good to go. There's really no penalty to not writing to the EXIF except not having certain fields show up in that Windows property dialog that nobody should ever use in the first place. And if the information isn't there, it's unlikely to hurt you. So that would be my advice there. So here we have it. We have a really nice new online metadata viewing tool that has some special capabilities that frankly I think make it much more useful than the others that already exist. And it's open source software that you can use on your own site or in your own web app. And that is really, really cool. So thanks for watching. Once again, I'm Carl Seibert. As always, reach out on social media or in the comments here or in the comments on the blog and let us know what's on your mind. Particularly, let us know if you're able to use this software. If you've integrated this software into your own site or into some application, let us know how that goes. We'd be really, really interested. And until next time, mind your metadata.